Hi, welcome to Tuesday Trash Talk at 10. My name is Cheryl Baldwin and I'm with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, as well as I run the What's In, What's Out program for the Recycle CT Foundation. Today we're talking about electronics and e-waste, i.e. electronic waste. But before I begin, I want to remind you I would love to talk about other topics. And if there's something that you want me to talk about in the future, by all means, put it in the comments section and I'll get to it in the future. So, electronics. Let's start by first asking, what are they? Well, they're things that we're familiar with. Cell phones, computers, televisions, stereo equipment, DVD players, printers, VHS cassette players, what else? Anything with a plug is what I'm told. It may change for small appliances, kind of depends on your community, but you'll find that computers, televisions, printers, monitors, and even old-fashioned CPUs are all part of electronics. And all of those materials can be recovered and recycled in Connecticut. So what's interesting is that unlike our bottles and cans program, or the program where we put, fiber and bottles and cans in our container and they're picked up by a MRF, in Connecticut we have a different structure for recycling, and it's called a stewardship program. We have an electronic stewardship program. And what it did, it was created by law back in 2007, and so we've had it for a long time. It's very much like the paint program. I think I've talked to you about the paint program in the past, where when you buy some paint, you have to pay a small fee, maybe 25 cents, 35 cents, depending on the size of the can. And all that money goes into a program that the manufacturers run. Paint Care is the program. And they have a program where they collect all the paint and then recycle it at no cost, because it's already been paid for through the consumption or consuming or purchasing of the product. Electronics is very similar, except the electronics program, they don't put a fee that you can see on the different items. They just integrate it within the cost of the product. So every time you buy a television, there might be a few pennies, stereo, DVD, etc. Well, actually, it's specific items. It'd be televisions, computers, and printers. A few pennies are put into the coffers, if you will, and that program is paid for through pennies, because when you pile them all up, it's enough to pay for the collection and processing so that materials are recycled. So, like other stewardship programs, there's only certain materials that are required by law to be recovered in the program, but there's so many more materials that have value, and so we're going to talk about all of that. So first, under the law, things that are referred to as covered, meaning that they're covered in the law, so they're covered electronic devices. The materials that are in the law include televisions, computers, this is an old laptop if you can't see it, as well as printers, and if you had an old computer or a desktop, it would include the monitor and the CPU. All of those materials are covered electronic devices, and those are all required by law to be collected for recycling at no cost. And municipalities are required to provide a program. So some municipalities have a transfer station. You might go to the transfer station once a week already for your recycling, and maybe they also have a box out for textiles, maybe they have a swap shop, and then maybe they also have a place for electronics. That's great. But sometimes we don't have transfer stations, and if that's the case, your municipality may do one-day collection events, which means they may only have one day a year, or maybe they have a couple days in the spring and maybe a couple of days in the fall. But ultimately, municipalities are required to put together a program for the collection of the material for us as residents to have access to it. The materials that would go into that program would have to include all the covered materials, right? The TV, the computer, the printer, the monitor, the CPU, etc. However, it might expand it. They might actually contract with a company that wants more than that, and they won't charge you for it, such as phones, because they have value. Or they'll allow all the cords There's so many cords. So many cords. And maybe they'll allow stereo equipment or DVD players and VHS cassette players or stereo equipment, if I didn't already say that. All of that material may be added. In fact, I'm told that sometimes municipalities will even go further than that and allow things such as toasters or vacuum cleaners. But you'll have to check with your municipality before you assume that. So electronics can all be recovered and at no cost. That's right, electronics recycling is free because of this stewardship program, which is pretty cool. So before I go a little bit further, I want to remind you, because I sadly forgot to share, we usually look at the 3 R's first, right? We look at waste reduction, and then we look at reuse before we think of recycling. And it's the same thing in electronics. It's not easy. Manufacturers will sometimes design their products to become obsolete pretty quickly and require certain upgrades until some point your computer or your phone or your tablet just can't upgrade and that you have to buy a new piece of equipment. But sometimes it's as simple as the battery. And so the thing we need to be aware of is try to buy first for durability, and then think about buying for repairability. Can my item be repaired? Televisions are pretty tough. Televisions are going in a different direction, but you might be able to find somebody to repair your TV. Computers can definitely be repaired, and whether or not you want to repair it or you want a new one is your choice, but repairing is clearly much better than recycling. And phones are also repairable. I know that I have an old phone, but if you put a new battery in it, it's going to last a lot longer. However, it's very challenging sometimes to do that because manufacturers will make it very difficult to be able to figure out how to remove the battery and then replace it. However, there's a really groovy group. I don't know if you're familiar with iFixit, but iFixit.com is a site where I'm just going to say geniuses have learned how to take apart things. They just take them apart and then putting them back together again. They write a manual to help us figure out how to do different repair work, including taking it apart and putting it back together, which to me is phenomenal. And why do they do this? Because manufacturers don't necessarily want us to repair their items. And so it's a do-it-yourself. It's a hack job, if you will. But if you're old enough to remember, when you bought your car, you used to be able to buy a Chilton manual. I recall this. And you used to be able to do some of the repair work on your car. You used to be able to, you do the oil change, you change your battery, but then you get deeper and you start doing, you change the spark plugs. I remember changing my manifold. You learn how to do certain things. Cars are much more complex now. It's not as easy to do that. And it's the same sometimes with our electronics. But sometimes just even the complexity of changing a battery isn't as hard as we think. And so I encourage you to check out iFixit.com. Sometimes we also have electronics that are reusable, but we don't want them anymore. Maybe we don't watch DVDs anymore. Maybe we don't have a CD player. Everything's streamed. And if that's the case, if you have electronics that are reusable, you can donate them to the traditional thrifts and consignments, but you could also look at sharing them and giving them away to folks in your community. And there are a couple of different sites. Of course, you're probably familiar with Craigslist. Craigslist has a section called Free Stuff. And then I've been told that Facebook, I looked this up, but I'm not a member myself, but Facebook has a couple of groups depending on what part of Connecticut you're in, and it might be called Buy Nothing, because it's all about the sharing economy and sharing stuff with other people. It might also be Free Stuff, and sometimes it's Free Things. And so those are all different Facebook groups that are local. And then, of course, there's Free Cycle. And that's the whole point of Free Cycle, is about giving away stuff because you don't necessarily need money for it. And so those are great opportunities to share your stuff that you don't want, but it still works. So if you can't repair it, you can't give it away, well then recycling is definitely it. And so again, check in with your municipality whether or not they take all the different things that you have in your home that you're trying to get rid of, and whether or not they have ongoing collection events or one day. In terms of where it goes, I get a lot of questions generally about recycling and where the materials go. And for electronics, it's a little bit different. For our bottles and cans, of course, we have materials recovery facilities that take and process the materials, and then they bale up the paper and the plastic jugs, etc., and they send it off as raw commodities for sale. In the electronics world, because electronics actually have a lot of hazards associated with it, which is why we don't want you to put televisions and other items in the trash, we actually certify the recyclers. Recyclers have to be certified in Connecticut to be able to recycle electronics. We have 4 companies that currently recycle our electronics. One of them is in Connecticut. You might be familiar with Take 2 in Waterbury. And then there are 3 others, one in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and then Pennsylvania. All of those 4 companies are certified to take our materials. And why do we certify? Not only because of the hazards involved with this material, but because you're probably all familiar with the movies that we've seen and the horrible reports that we've seen on the news about electronics going into developing countries where the way that they process, because they don't have the same environmental regulations we have, is like open burning, and it's really sad. We're all very saddened by it. So the Connecticut law tries to have a little bit more control over where materials go and how materials are processed. So to be certified to recycle and collect all these materials in Connecticut, you need to provide a bit of a paper trail. We not only want to know where the municipality's stuff is going, which recycler, but we want to know how much is going there and then what happens to it after that. And so I was talking to my colleague at Deep, and he shared that we have steel and aluminum that go to domestic markets. We have circuit boards that are taken out of all of the materials, and then just the circuit boards are sent over to Europe, which includes Finland and Sweden, and those are smelted down. Apparently our leaded glass is smelted domestically, and then we have Pentium chips and other kinds of boards, and those are also smelted domestically. And then we do have some plastics when they're taken apart. The plastics, some used to go to China, more now goes to India if there are plastics involved. I'm trying to think of where else. It was really quite fascinating, but we really want to know where they're going and then how they're being processed, because we want to keep track and make sure that we're not just sending our crap, if you will, to developing countries. I found it interesting about cords. There's so many cords, and if a cord is reusable, by all means, share it with somebody before you get rid of it. But the cords, they actually apparently strip it down into the wire metals, and the wire itself, when you aggregate a bunch of it, has a lot of value as well, and all of that material is recovered. So it was really exciting to see. If you want to learn more about the e-waste program, my colleague Mark Latham does a great job of running that program, and there's all sorts of reports if you want to geek out in data. By all means, I will put the link after this. So I thank you for joining me and learning a little bit more about electronics waste in Connecticut, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Tuesday Trash Talks at 10. Thank you.